Civetot, 1096. In October 1096, the first large crusading force to reach Asia Minor was already waiting in a trap. This was not the disciplined army of princes and knights that would capture Jerusalem 3 years later. It was the People's Crusade, a loose mass of armed pilgrims, minor knights, civilians, and adventurers inspired largely by the preaching of Peter the Hermit. They had crossed from Constantinople into Asia Minor and camped at Civetot, near the Sea of Marmara. Discipline deteriorated almost immediately. Groups broke away to raid the countryside around Nicaea, the capital of the Seljuk Sultan Kilij Arslan I. One raiding force occupied the fortress of Zaragordos. The Seljuks surrounded it, cut the defenders off from water, and forced its surrender. Then Kilij Arslan turned toward the larger camp at Civetot. Peter the Hermit was away in Constantinople seeking help, and the people he had led east were now operating without the one figure who had held the movement together. When the Crusaders marched out from Civetot on October 21st, Seljuk forces struck them before they could organize effectively. The camp was overrun and the expedition ceased to exist as an independent army. Some survivors escaped back toward Byzantine territory, and a few later joined the main First Crusade. But the People's Crusade itself ended there. Not every army that took the cross was destroyed. The First Crusade captured Jerusalem. Richard the Lionheart's army survived the Third Crusade. Other expeditions withdrew, negotiated, or simply failed to achieve their objectives. The armies here are the major crusading forces that were shattered, dispersed, captured, or reduced so badly that they could no longer continue their original campaign as organized armies. Civetot established the first method. An army with enthusiasm but weak command could be destroyed before the real campaign had even begun. The three armies of 1101. The victory at Jerusalem in 1099 created a dangerous illusion. 2 years later, another wave of crusaders entered Anatolia expecting to cross territory that the First Crusade had already crossed successfully. Instead, 3 separate armies entered Asia Minor without coordinating their movements, and the Seljuks destroyed them in succession. Modern scholarship identifies that lack of synchronization, combined with route choices inside Anatolia, as a central weakness of the campaign. The first and largest formation contained a major Lombard contingent along with forces connected to Raymond of Toulouse, Stephen of Blois, Stephen of Burgundy, and German crusaders. Instead of moving directly towards Syria, the expedition pushed north and east across the Anatolian plateau. Near Merziphon, it encountered a coalition that included the Seljuks of Rum and Danish Mended forces. The Crusaders were harassed, deprived of easy access to supplies, and forced into a battle after a difficult march. Their formation eventually broke. Important leaders escaped, but much of the army did not. The Second Army, commanded by William of Nevers, arrived too late to join them. William crossed Anatolia independently, reached Iconium, failed to capture it, and continued toward Heraclea. By then the Seljuks had already dealt with the First Army and could concentrate on the next one. Supplies and water became increasingly difficult to obtain. Near Heraclea, Turkish forces attacked the exhausted column. Much of the infantry was abandoned when mounted survivors escaped, and William himself survived with only a fraction of the force that had entered Anatolia. Then came the Third Army, associated with William IX of Aquitaine, Welf of Bavaria, and Hugh of Vermandois. It entered the same strategic problem almost immediately. Kilij Arslan had interior lines, mounted forces, knowledge of the terrain, and the ability to concentrate against one crusading column at a time. Near Heraclea, this third land force was also ambushed and broken. William of Aquitaine escaped. The army did not. The extraordinary part was not that one crusading army had lost. It was that 3 armies crossed into the same theater within months of one another and were prevented from combining their strength. The First Crusade had forced its way through Anatolia as a huge coalition. In 1101, the reinforcements arrived as separate targets. Conrad III's army, 1147. Almost half a century later, the Second Crusade repeated the journey with kings at its head. Conrad III of Germany brought one of the 2 largest armies toward the Holy Land. After crossing the Bosporus, his force moved into the Anatolian interior. Supplies became a problem, and Seljuk forces under Sultan Mesud I avoided giving the Germans the kind of straightforward battle that heavily armed Western cavalry wanted. Instead, they harassed the column as it moved through difficult country. Near Dorylaeum in October 1147, Conrad's expedition suffered a crushing defeat. Older narratives sometimes describe almost complete annihilation, but the surviving evidence does not justify a precise percentage. Conrad, nobles, knights, and other survivors escaped. What had disappeared was the German army's ability to continue independently at anything like its original strength. Conrad retreated toward Nicaea and eventually joined Louis VII of France. The king remained an important participant in the crusade, but the great German expedition that had marched east with him had already been reduced to a remnant. It was not destroyed because German knights suddenly forgot how to fight. It was destroyed because an army deep in hostile territory was spending men, horses, food, and time every day, while its enemy could choose when to make contact. Louis VII's army, 1148. The French saw what had happened to Conrad and changed their route. Louis VII's army moved through western Anatolia and fought off several attacks successfully, but surviving one ambush did not solve the larger problem. The French still had to move thousands of people, horses, baggage animals, weapons, and supplies across mountain country, while Seljuk forces watched the column for weak points. In January 1148, the army crossed Mount Cadmus. Geoffrey of Rancon, commanding the vanguard, moved farther ahead than planned. That stretched the formation and exposed the baggage, foot soldiers, and slower parts of the column. The Seljuks attacked the gap. Fighting spread through terrain where the Crusaders had difficulty maintaining a coherent battle line. Louis survived, but the army took severe losses. The survivors eventually reached the Byzantine port of Anatolia. Here the defeat became logistical rather than tactical. There was not enough shipping to carry everyone onward. Louis and selected members of the army sailed for the Principality of Antioch. Large numbers of poorer crusaders and troops were left to attempt the remaining journey overland, where many were killed, captured, or simply disappeared from the expedition. Louis reached the Levant. His original army did not. That distinction matters, because medieval chronicles often continue following the king and make the expedition appear continuous. Militarily, it was not. By the time Louis arrived in Syria, the force that had left Western Europe had been repeatedly cut apart by terrain, supply problems, separation, and attack. Hattin, 1187. On July 3, 1187, the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem marched away from water. That decision would destroy the most important field army the Crusader states possessed. Saladin had attacked Tiberias. The Frankish army assembled at Sapharia, where it had water and a defensible position. Moving east to relieve Tiberias meant crossing dry country, while Saladin's mounted forces controlled the surrounding space. The leadership debated what to do, but King Guy of Lusignan eventually ordered the advance. Saladin did not need to smash the Crusaders with one enormous charge. His troops harassed the marching column, slowed it, threatened its rear, and prevented it from reaching the water of the Sea of Galilee. The Crusaders halted near the horns of Hattin, already exhausted and thirsty. During the fighting, smoke from fires added to the confusion, while Saladin's forces maintained pressure around an increasingly compressed army. On July 4th, attempts to break out failed. Infantry cohesion collapsed. Groups of cavalry charged or escaped without restoring the wider position. Eventually, the central force around King Guy was overwhelmed. Guy was captured. So were many of the leading nobles. Reynold of Chatillon was killed after the battle. The military orders suffered especially damaging losses. The scale of the defeat left the Kingdom of Jerusalem with so few field troops that Saladin could move rapidly against one settlement after another. Hattin was more than a lost battle. The kingdom had concentrated the military force it needed to defend everything else, then lost that force in one place. After that, the castles and cities were still standing. The army that was supposed to save them was gone. Frederick Barbarossa's army. 1190, Frederick Barbarossa came east to repair the disaster. His German army was one of the most formidable forces of the Third Crusade. It crossed the Balkans, entered Anatolia, endured repeated attacks and supply problems, and still managed to defeat Seljuk opposition and force its way into Iconium in May 1190. This was not an army being casually swept aside. It had survived a campaign that had destroyed earlier expeditions. Then, on June 10th, Frederick drowned in the Salef, the modern Goksu River. Accounts differ over exactly how the accident happened, and the emperor's death is often treated as the moment his army instantly collapsed. The actual sequence was slower. His son Frederick of Swabia assumed command and brought the remainder onward. They reached Antioch in early July. But the expedition had lost the emperor who had held its enormous coalition together. Men turned back, while sickness inflicted further losses. A modern assessment of the German Crusade stresses that epidemic disease, not the drowning alone, was crucial in reducing the force before it could contribute on anything like its original scale. A much smaller German remnant eventually continued toward Acre. The army had beaten enemy forces, crossed hostile territory, and captured a major Seljuk city. What it could not replace was its command structure once the man at the center of it disappeared into a river. The Fifth Crusade, 1221. The Fifth Crusade did something earlier expeditions had repeatedly failed to do. It captured Damietta in Egypt. That success convinced its leaders that they could push deeper into the Nile Delta and threaten Cairo. In the summer of 1221, the crusading army advanced south despite serious disagreement among its commanders and despite another peace offer from the Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil. Then geography began closing around them. The Nile and its branches were not simply obstacles on a map. They were the transportation system that kept the Crusader advance supplied. Al-Kamil used the Mahala Canal to move ships behind the Crusaders and cut their communications with Damietta. As Muslim forces gathered, the invaders found themselves unable to advance effectively and increasingly unable to maintain their position. The Crusaders finally ordered a retreat. Al-Kamil's forces opened waterways and flooded parts of the eastern bank. Men and animals struggled through rising water and mud while enemy forces pressed around the shrinking column. By August 28th, the army was trapped near Al-Baramun. There was no open road back to Damietta and no realistic route forward. On August 30th, the army surrendered. The terms were far better than the Crusaders' military position might have suggested. Damietta was returned, hostages were exchanged, and the survivors were allowed to leave. No great cavalry charge destroyed this army. A canal did. More precisely, Al-Kamil turned the Nile Delta into part of his military system and left a large crusading army surrounded in a landscape it could no longer move through or supply itself across. La Forbie, 1244. Hattin had shown what happened when the Kingdom of Jerusalem lost almost its entire field army. In 1244, it happened again. Jerusalem had recently fallen to Khwarezmian forces driven west by the upheavals created by the Mongol conquests. The remaining Frankish states formed an unusual coalition with Muslim rulers from Syria, who also regarded the Egyptian Ayyubids and their Khwarezmian allies as a threat. The resulting army was one of the largest forces the Latin East had assembled since Hattin. On October 17th, near the village of La Forbie or Hirabia, north of Gaza, the coalition met the Egyptian army and its Khwarezmian allies. The battle became catastrophic for the Frankish contingent. Contemporary numbers are difficult to reconcile, so precise totals should be treated carefully, but the broader result is not in doubt. The military orders lost most of the fighting forces they had committed. Large numbers of nobles, knights, and soldiers were killed or captured. Only a relatively small portion escaped. For the Crusader states, La Forbie was not famous in later Western memory the way Hattin became famous. Militarily, that did not make it less serious. The Latin East had spent decades rebuilding enough manpower to put a major army into the field again. In a single battle, much of that investment vanished. Louis IX's Seventh Crusade, 1250. Louis IX of France entered Egypt with a more carefully organized expedition than many earlier crusading armies. In June 1249, his forces captured Damietta quickly. For months, the city served as a secure base while the Crusaders prepared to move toward Cairo. Then the army advanced toward Mansoura. In February 1250, Crusaders discovered a way across the canal separating them from the Egyptian position. A mounted force led by Louis's brother Robert of Artois crossed first. Instead of waiting for the rest of the army to consolidate, Robert's group pushed on into Mansoura. Inside the town, the advantage of mounted shock combat disappeared. Streets, buildings, and Egyptian resistance broke up the attackers. Robert was killed and much of the advance force was destroyed. The larger Crusader army fought on, but Mansoura had not produced the breakthrough Louis needed. Then the campaign stopped moving. Egyptian forces disrupted communications with Damietta. Food became scarce. Disease spread through the camp. Men who could still fight had to support an army increasingly filled with sick soldiers. Louis eventually ordered a retreat north. By then, the decision had come too late. Near Faraskour in early April, Egyptian forces overtook the retreat. The exhausted crusading formation disintegrated. Louis IX himself was captured along with many members of his army. Damietta was eventually returned as part of the settlement that secured his release. The Seventh Crusade had begun with one of the easiest major victories of Louis's career. It ended with the King of France as a prisoner because the army remained too long in a position where its food, communications, health, and mobility were all deteriorating at the same time. Tunis, 1270. 20 years after his capture in Egypt, Louis IX tried again. This time the expedition sailed not to Egypt or directly to the Holy Land, but to Tunis in North Africa. The decision has been debated ever since. Modern scholarship places responsibility for the Tunis strategy primarily with Louis himself, rather than treating him as a passive victim of somebody else's scheme. Whatever the political calculations, the crusading army landed during the North African summer and established itself outside Tunis. There was no Hattin and no Mansoura. Disease began doing the work. Illness spread through the camp. Louis himself became sick and died on August 25, 1270. His brother Charles of Anjou arrived 2 days later and took control of a campaign that had already lost the king who had created it. Negotiations followed. On October 30th, Charles reached an agreement with the ruler of Tunis. The next day the crusade was abandoned, and most of the surviving army withdrew towards Sicily before making its way home. The army had not been massacred. It had stopped being capable of carrying out the expedition for which it had crossed the Mediterranean. For Louis IX, the final enemy was neither cavalry nor fortifications. It was a camp that could no longer keep its own king alive. Acre, 1291. By 1291, there was no great crusading kingdom left to place a field army between the Mamluks and their target. There was Acre. The port had become the political and commercial center of what remained of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Templars, Hospitallers, other military forces, local defenders, and reinforcements from overseas were concentrated behind its walls. Outside them, Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil assembled the army that would eliminate the last major Frankish center on the mainland. The siege began in April. The Mamluks did not depend on one assault. Siege engines bombarded the defenses while troops advanced works toward the walls, and miners attacked vulnerable points beneath them. Crusader sorties attempted to destroy the siege machinery but could not stop the pressure. By mid-May, sections of the defensive system were failing. On May 18th, the Mamluks launched the decisive assault. Once breaches were forced and attackers entered the city, organized resistance across most of Acre collapsed. Soldiers and civilians rushed toward the harbor, where ships offered the only practical escape. Some defenders continued fighting in fortified positions, particularly in the Templar quarter. That resistance survived for days after the main city had fallen, but it could not reverse the result. By May 28, the last major resistance had ended. The remaining Latin coastal positions were abandoned or captured soon afterward. Contemporary observers understood Acre as the effective end of Latin rule on the mainland. Hattin had destroyed the army that protected the kingdom. Acre destroyed what remained after the kingdom had run out of armies to replace it. Nicopolis, 1396. A century after Acre, crusading warfare had moved decisively into the Balkans. Ottoman expansion threatened Hungary and placed increasing pressure on Constantinople. In response, a multinational coalition formed around King Sigismund of Hungary, reinforced by prominent French and Burgundian nobles, including John of Nevers. In 1396, they crossed the Danube and besieged Nicopolis. Sultan Bayezid I moved rapidly to meet them. The coalition had experienced troops, but it also had competing military cultures and commanders who disagreed about how the coming battle should be fought. When the Ottoman army approached, the French and Burgundian men-at-arms insisted on taking the leading role. They advanced against an Ottoman defensive position instead of allowing the Hungarians to shape the engagement according to their experience fighting Turkish forces. The first Ottoman screen gave ground. Behind it, the Crusaders encountered defensive stakes and Janissary infantry. Many Western men-at-arms dismounted and continued uphill on foot. They eventually pushed through the infantry in front of them. That looked like success. Then they reached the crest. The men who arrived there were separated from much of the Allied army, exhausted from the uphill fight, and faced by fresh Ottoman cavalry reserves. Their formation collapsed under the new attack. The wider Christian army then came apart as the defeat spread. Some fled toward the Danube, others were killed or captured. John of Nevers survived as a prisoner. Sigismund escaped. Nicopolis was not a story about armored knights being obsolete. The French vanguard had actually broken through multiple layers of the Ottoman position. The problem was that they had spent their strength doing it before reaching the force Bayezid still had available to finish the battle. Varna, 1444. The last army in this sequence entered the Balkans with a plan that depended on the Ottomans being divided. King Vladislav III of Poland and Hungary and the Hungarian commander John Hunyadi led a new crusading expedition in 1444. Naval forces were supposed to help prevent Ottoman troops in Anatolia from crossing into Europe. If that worked, the Christian land army could campaign against a weakened Ottoman position in the Balkans. It did not work. Sultan Murad II crossed back into Europe with major elements of his army. The Crusaders continued toward the Black Sea coast and reached the area around Varna. On November 10th, the two armies met. The battlefield itself restricted the Christian options, with the sea, lake, and rough ground limiting movement. The coalition could not simply avoid battle and continue marching as though Murad were not there. The fighting did not begin as an immediate Ottoman rout of the Crusaders. Hunyadi directed aggressive attacks against parts of the Ottoman line, and the battle remained contested. Then Vladislav made the decision that came to define Varna. The young king led his own mounted force toward the Janissaries, protecting Murad's center. He was killed during the attack. Medieval accounts disagree on some details of the moment, but they agree on its consequence. The king disappeared from command at the most dangerous stage of the battle. The coalition's cohesion collapsed. Hunyadi escaped, but he could not restore an army that had lost both the battle and the monarch around whom much of the expedition had been built. Murad held the field. Vladislav was dead at 20 years old. His body was never recovered with certainty. The campaign designed to drive deep into Ottoman Europe ended outside Varna, with its coalition scattered and its command broken. Nearly 3.5 centuries after Civetot, another crusading army had marched into enemy territory, expecting the campaign ahead to decide everything. Instead, one battle decided that there would be no campaign left to continue.